So with this one, we're going to be looking at circles, and we're going to be giving those circles a kind of 3D feel, or letting the pattern follow the circular shape. A lot of what we do with Doodle is to create little frames for ourselves to work in, because it is always this thing about this big white space being quite daunting. If we start breaking it up and giving us somewhere to start, it's less terrifying to work with. So I'm going to put some circles onto the page. Now, I want them to overlap, but I want to think about one of them is going to be on the front. I'm using pencil to begin with, just so that I can sort of mark them out. You can rub the pencil out in the end, or you can leave it. You'll probably disappear into the doodle. So I want them to overlap. So when they overlap, this is my first one. This is my designated number 1 circle. Make sure that you stop your line so that you don't go over. So you've got that sense immediately straight away of them being two kind of together. And as we keep on adding sort of circles to this, we're going to get more. Whoops, that one's got a bit wobbly. They don't have to be perfect circles. I'm just saying that because mine certainly aren't. You can use different size ones with pleasure if you want, just to kind of give yourself a different feel. But as we go, we're going to make sure that if they're behind, like this one's behind, my line has got to leave these two kind of leaf shapes. It's got to stop. So I'm going to go around the top and then bring my pencil off and then go in underneath. And what that does is it gives you that feeling that these are in front of each other or behind each other in a different kind of way. So it's all to do with it's a very, very simple trick to kind of create perspective. But you can throw in some different sized ones. I think I'm going to do one more this size, and I think I'm going to see if I can find a couple of different ones to pop in as well. Because I'm not going to make it look like although it sort of has that feeling of a ball, a sort of load of balls of wool, I'm not going to make it completely naturalistically a ball of wool or basket of wool. So I'm going to put some different sized ones in. If you've got a solid shape like this, you just have to think about, though I can't see inside it, I can take my line from here round to here like that, and then that sort of is doing the same thing. It's popping one in to the picture, and you can put as many as you want or different sort of size ones on, and you can decide, you can keep them so they're all inside the frame, so they're all not disappearing off, or we can disappear them off the page when we get to that point. But we can keep on adding these circles in, and they're going to give us a load of forms to work with. And then we think about how these forms are going to interact with each other, because if they were like a basket of ceramic balls or something, they would be casting shadows on each other. So it's not massively difficult, but we can think about how they're going to interact with each other. We can slightly change our doodle and add a bit more line work in, but we'll get to that. Like, I'm going to use this is my fancy circly drawy thing that I don't use very much because, I always forget it, but I've got it. But it's a sort of like an iris that opens and closes. So I'm kind of like, I'm going to chuck that one into the mix as well, just to add some in. And maybe this has got the feeling of like it could be frog spawn in the water, or it could be planets or some sort of celestial, or maybe it's like, go the other scale, it's sort of like atoms down the far end of an electron microscope. So where I've got my edge of my paper here, you can just see that's top of my paper there. I'm going to let mine come off the edge of the paper like that, so it just disappears off. So it's sort of taking the picture off into the wild blue yonder. But I don't know how many of these will get done in tonight's session, but once you've got them all kind of mapped out, we can go off and do more of them. And I'm going to use the outside of this to do a great big circle, just because I can. And you can just get like another one kind of hiding in the background there. And if you want to, if you get into doing different sort of size circles, you can always then go in and use a smaller one to do some smaller circles. And even if you think, oh no, it's too late, I can't get one in, you can sneaky one in. And because we're doing it in pencil to begin with, you can always erase a little bit of a line. But say you wanted to do that, this is why I discovered I don't have any erasers, but you would draw your circle and just take out that bit of line that came through there. But I'm just going to put a couple of small ones in just to change the scale a bit, like that. And this is just one of those sort of plastic circle drawing devices, but you can use anything that's round, anything that's to hand, and I can use even my ink pots, but just make sure the lid's on properly before you turn the ink pot. Yes, it doesn't half go everywhere, and it's surprising how much more of it there is when you drop an ink bottle as to when you're sort of dipping your pen in trying to get some into your pen. Right, so of course you can fill up the whole of your page with the circles, but I'm going to sort of stop there because I want to get into some patterning. So I'm going to use just some fine line pens. You can choose whichever, if you want to work in a colour, totally go in for a colour. We can do some colour sort of detailing later. Like all of these, we start off with quite a fine line, and then we're going to build some areas in that will give us something to sort of play with later. So we're not going to draw the lines in pen because we're going to work to them, but we're not going to we're going to sort of almost imagine that they're invisible, that we're just using them as a guide time, because it's a weird thing about when you draw things, people always start trying to draw like an outline, and actually there's no such thing as an outline. You can't go up to somebody and touch where their outline goes across their skin. So it's quite nice. We know it's there, but we're just going to work to it. So the first we're going to start off with quite a simple one. We want to get some sort of stripes going on this so that they're going to be falling in bands. Now the key is that when something is coming towards you, it's sort of like this point here, it's going to look relatively straight, but as the lines move away, they're going to become more curved looking, and that will give this a sense of being curved. So you might want to just watch this bit first and then sort of I'll go slow and you can bring it afterwards. So if you start off with a line kind of going through the middle like that, and then you're going to do a line next to it, but it's just going to become slightly more curved, and you curve it towards the direction you're going. So as you're going left, we're going to make those lines slightly curve out a little bit more each time. And you can see how by doing that, that's already starting to give that feeling that this is a curved shape moving out into space. And this is my one that's kind of on top of all the others. And as you also get towards the edge, if you get them slightly closer together, that also, so you have slightly more lines, that also starts to make it look like it's disappearing away around sort of, into the distance. And then so when I've done that half, I always find it easier to kind of start in the middle and do one half round and then come back the other way, because you kind of got the feel. And then the other way, you're going to bring your lines curving out towards the right hand side. And of course, once you kind of get your head around this trick, and we might try this later on, we can start playing with it and creating some strange illusions that can be quite fun. But we'll see how we get on with this so far. So I'm just going to do one closer together around, disappearing around that side. And that kind of gives us straight away, that makes it feel like this is moving round. So if we're going to go and put pattern into this, we're going to follow these lines that we've created for ourselves, because it's giving us a lovely template so that we can do our pattern smaller at the top and then obviously bigger in the middle and going smaller again. And that'll kind of give us this kind of illusion kind of feel. So we can do quite a simple pattern. We don't have to do anything, again, massively complicated. We could do some stripes. We could do some alternate solid black stripes, and then we're going to put some pattern in between. So for the solid black stripes, I am going to use brush pen. I was going to say pen brush, and that didn't come out right. So I'm just going to do every other one in black. Now, if you haven't got a brush pen, you can use any thicker pen, or you can use colour pencil, or you can just leave them white instead and come back and colour them in later. But if you just do every other one, that's going to make that shape really strong. And once you've gone down the edges carefully, you can fill in the middle bit quite quickly. And that's going to give us that nice sort of strong dark line. And then we're going to come back up, and I sort of find if you kind of do the outline first of each stripe that you've created, and then you can kind of more quickly fill it in. That's it, like that. And then we're going to do the next one along, so it's going to become like a sort of Tim Burton's beach ball, you know, very kind of black and white stripy. And if you've got that sort of curved shape working quite nicely, although it's really very, very simple, probably the simplest pattern ever, it does sort of look quite effective. And then I'm just going to take that last thin stripe round, and that's sort of got that side in. So I've now got, so now I can go back the other way. And I do recommend, if you can get a set of pens with a brush pen in, they're really good fun to use to get some really dark areas in. And because they've got this tapered nib, so they've got like a very thin, you can actually do some quite thin line work with them, and then sort of you can have fun. You just have to put a tiny bit of pressure on the brush and it will make a thicker line, so you can get quite sensitive sort of pattern work with them, and they're quite useful for going in because you can colour in quite small. I'm going a bit wobbly there, never mind. You can colour in quite small spaces with a little tip quite quickly. So that's it, and we're going to come around and disappear that one down. And just keep going to get the last one in. There we go, and that's just, and with this one I'm going to leave that last little tiny bit white because that's, you know, where my line comes and that's where my stripe is. So don't worry, because whatever's going to come behind it will help to show it up. It'll become more obvious. So once we've got a nice striping like this, then we can put a pattern in between those stripes. So we're going to put some pattern work down the white section. So again, we don't have to do anything very complicated. I'm just going to do some, what I think of as the little rainbow ones, where you do a sort of rainbow or a sort of half moon and then get them in going smaller and smaller. I hope that's coming out. So I'm doing them so they're fitting either side of the line. What I'm going to do is map out the outline of them, and then I'll go back and fill in the detail because it'll be a bit clearer. All that I do is, as I come down and I get towards the middle part of the circle where those lines are slightly fatter, my half moon shapes get fatter and bigger. And then as I get past the equator, you think of it as a planet, and come back down towards the poles, those lines are going to get, those half moon shapes are going to get smaller and more tightly packed together. And that is going to help to give me that feeling of it sort of growing and shrinking away. And then once I've got those drawn out, I can just go back in and I just put maybe 3 or 4 sort of echoing hoop or half hoops. That's why it looks like a sort of child's drawing of a rainbow, sort of. Just sort of coming down. So you can see how that starts to look. Because it's following the shape that we've defined, it helps to enhance that, and it goes along with it and it works in harmony with the shape. You can, of course, if you get into these sort of illusion ones, you can work against the shape and do something completely different, but it's actually surprisingly hard to pull off because your brain, wants to make it work. So again, so as I come down, I'm just going to do my outlines of the half circles first. I find if I do this, I can sort of plan how I want them and I can see them, and as they get down to the middle, they're going to get bigger and bigger, just to give that swelling kind of feel, and then they're going to come smaller and smaller again, just so that they're enhancing that kind of perspective trick that we've got going on. And this works exactly the same way the other side. At the top we do little tiny ones, and as they come down they're going to get bigger and take up more space, and as they come down again they go smaller. And of course there's that thing that I always say that I always think sounds like a really daft thing to say, but it's not. If you think about it, it's quite important to point it out. The small ones, your lines are closer together. Closer together lines means you're putting more black pen onto the paper, and so therefore it's darker. So part of the illusion that this helps create is that as the line work comes closer together and smaller patterns, they look darker, and that helps again with sort of an idea of shade and tone. So if you want to make any part of your pattern look darker, go in and do more lines closer together, because the more lines you do, the darker the overall effect is, because you've just got more black on the page. And of course the ultimate shadow is to put the thick fat brush pen stroke on, but you can still get quite a lot of subtle tone just by allowing these to go closer together. And I actually think doing this one, it's starting to look a little bit like a sort of sea anemone, like when you see the sort of dried out shells. I think you could work on this. You could certainly use this kind of technique to draw something like a sea anemone, or that has that sort of all those little spots getting bigger, and they if you look at them, they change in size just in this way. So in the middle of the anemone, the fattest part, they're quite big, and then they go thinner and thinner because there's less room to put them in. So it's doing the same kind of thing. So I've got this is looking quite like, it's rather sort of 60s psychedelic, this, isn't it? It's got sort of a Mary Quant kind of monochrome pattern feel. I could see this is a kind of rather arty lampshade in Conran's or something, with their sort of retro. It's got quite, I think it's something about the half circles, it gives it kind of a sort of rather retro vibe. So we'll do that last one in. Obviously I've used the same pattern on all of these stripes, which I think actually adds to that kind of retro lampshade feel. But you could completely do a different pattern down each white stripe if you fancied it. I think as long as you keep to the same rhythm so that you're getting smaller as you go down, any sort of pattern is going to work in this space. And if you're not confident about doing the pattern change to begin with, just choose the simplest pattern, even just like little groups of horizontal lines. And when I get to this very edge one, you almost aren't going to see the hoops on the far side. You're going to really just see the hoops on the near side, because they're kind of disappearing off round, and you can imagine they've kind of already kind of disappeared out of sight. But yeah, even just the simplest of pattern, if you just want to practice getting this rhythm of the change of scale and getting that feel to work, then choose the simplest pattern that you're happy doing, and then you can just think about the way it changes size. And on that white section, this one, I'm just going to see a little tiny bit of hoop pattern, hardly any, but it's going to disappear off sort of round the corner. So hopefully this is starting to really sort of pop out of the page and look quite like you could reach down and kind of pick it up as if it was some sort of ornament. And obviously I'm working relatively quickly because I want to get on to show you different ones. And I think it's the sort of thing that's worth taking a little bit of time over, just to get that nice rhythmic feel. And if you wanted to work in colour with this, a similar thing. If you keep your colours darker where your lines are smaller, so towards the top and the bottom, use stronger colours or heavier tones of colour. And as you come down to the middle of your sphere, which is now what we're drawing really, it's not a circle anymore, it's become a sphere, let the colours be lighter, either use lighter tones or lighter shades of the same colour, and it will have the same effect. It will give you this kind of 3D illusion. And if you want to go and colour afterwards, you could still do the same thing, so that as you go down, the colours get darker, and as you sort of in the middle, they stay lighter, and that will really enhance this kind of popping off the page feel. Now, what I'm going to do with the next ones is we're going to do another sort of pattern onto the ones around, but we always are going to we're going to imagine that these are in some way slightly real objects, and to help them sort of fit into space, we're going to add some tonal element behind these circles. If this circle or this sphere is casting a shadow on this one, and then down here there's more shadows, but it'll make sense. We'll get there. It might sound daunting at first, but it's not really. We've done similar before. We're just looking at it in a different kind of way. Right. So with this one, choose another one that's close to the first one where we started, and we're going to do a kind of similar thing to begin with. We're going to slightly change it up a bit. I want to do the same sort of thing completely the same thing to begin with, but we're going to put lines going crossing the first ones that we draw. So we're going to get like a cross hatch kind of feel. So same one with this one. I'm going to choose my center point to sort of come down like that, but of course it's hitting the one that's this first globe and it can't draw across it, so it's going to come down, it's going to stop to there because we want to get that illusion of it being behind the one in front. And same sort of thing, I'm going to do my lines curving out, but of course they're all going to stop at that point where they touch the globe in front, and then they're going to get slightly closer together towards the edges. So that's one side doing the same thing, and then this side is going to come in the same way, but oh, that's slightly gone a bit too fast there, but I think we'll live with it. We're going to go curving the other way and going closer together. So that gives us stripes in the same kind of way that we got stripes on this one. But now we're going to do a second set of stripes over the top of the first ones. But we're going to start from a different position. So again, you might just want to watch. The first line was going sort of north to south, as it were, of this particular globe, sort of that way. So the second one is going to go across it like that. So that is going the other way. So that's sort of, I suppose, east to west. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but instead of curving, I'm going to be curving towards that North Pole. So my lines are going to curve that way. So they're sort of curving up each time. So it's just doing exactly the same things we did before, but we're just doing it twice. And as they go up towards the top, it's going to get tighter together, and they're going to, as a result, get a bit more dense looking. So we get that top there, like that, so that's starting to curve up that way, and then we're going to come down from our equator, sort of down to the south pole of this one. But in the same sort of way, we've got to just remember that when we hit the circle on top, we have to stop our line. So you have to kind of, if you're not sure how to carry it on, you start drawing, and when you hit the sort of circle on top, lift your pen up, but then mime as if you're drawing the line, and then when you get the edge, pop your pen back on the paper and continue that line along, and that will give that lovely illusion of that line disappearing behind the one in front. So same sort of thing on this one. Again, I'm going to draw the pen along, even though it's only a little bit, lift my pen up, imagine that I'm drawing that line, put my pen down again and go up to the edge. And that's starting to kind of really get that to disappear off behind. And then the same with this little one here. I just see a tiny bit of it going along that edge there, into that, lift up my pen. Oh, and I can't see any more. It's not going to make it into the cut. No, that's all I can see of that. So that's kind of given me like a sort of grid that I can follow with a pattern. So just the same principle as when I'm doing the vertical pattern on this one, I want to try and fill up each square with pattern, but I'm going to make the pattern follow the shape of the squares, the outline that I've got. So again, we can just do a really sort of simple pattern. I'm going to start just by putting a circle in. So if I start in the middle, my circle fills up that hole like that, and then I'm just going to do circles, and they're going to follow the shapes that are in those squares that we've created all the way down until they're getting smaller and smaller. Apologies if you just heard a massive load of phone pings. My 4-year-old niece likes to send me 500 emojis at bedtime. It's a bedtime treat. So I forgot that was about to come in, so I should have silenced my phone, but apologies about that. But there's sort of like a weird hieroglyphics coming in. So that you see, because you're following the shape of that grid line, that makes those patterns enhance that curved shape. So I'm going to do the same thing on the row below. So I just fill up the square that I've drawn with a pattern, and it doesn't matter if you get an Easter egg shape or a perfect circle or a sort of whatever blob shape, but just by following the guidelines that we've got we've created with our grid, we can fill those shapes in, and they start working with the shape that we've got and not fighting it. So again, we can just draw them in, and again you can see how you could colour these in the same sort of way. You could if you were using a blue colour palette, you could start off with the little ones being in a very sort of dark navy, and then by the time you get to these larger ones, you could open up into a sort of sky blue, and all the way through the shades of blue, back down again to a sort of dark navy. And that would really help to enhance this kind of 3D trick. But it's quite nice because you don't really have to think about what you're drawing. Once you've drawn the grid, you can just follow what it's given you. And whatever it's given you will give you the shape of the globe that you're creating here. And I think you could do loads of these. I mean, this would be a really nice one to do in the black paper and white pen. That would be very satisfying. And I think it's sort of like, if you made these look quite ornate, they would look a bit like Christmas decorations, like sort of exotic Christmas baubles, and you could do a kind of Christmas card feel with some gold and metallics and silver kind of things on a coloured background and turn them into Christmas decorations. Or you could, as I think we've done in a previous one, we've done kind of I was going to do an Easter egg, and I didn't in the end, and then someone did an Easter egg for us so we could see what it would look like. But we could do like an Easter egg, so it's got quite a lot of nice applications. But again, as you come down to where the overlap happens, you just see a tiny little bit of circle. You're not going to see the whole circle. So you just stop it at the edge again. So you just see a little bit of curve sticking out there. And you can just sort of fit them in. And it's really starting to look like this one is curving away and it's sort of popping behind the other one. And then when you get to this edge here, you can decide, you can just do a flat circle, or you can even make it come slightly off the surface and it starts to look quite bumpy, as if these were pearls or bumps on a sea urchin's shell. I think they have shells. I think you'd call it a shell, wouldn't you, I suppose?
It reminds me of a disco ball.
It is very disco ball, isn't it? I think you could totally get your silver and gold pens out, metallic pens, and add some sort of disco gleam. This is a real one for your glitter pens, wouldn't it? Definitely. I think maybe it is getting quite a sort of retro feel. Right, my tea is just arrived, so I'm just going to mute very quickly and have a quick slurp. If you take my phone, Wednesday, and log on, you can... B has just sent me a load of emojis. You can reply.
What's the passcode for it?
656531.
Are you on?
Right, okay, so I'm just going to draw those last few in our intergalactic sea urchin disco ball, which we seem to be creating. And the obvious thing in a way is to draw in the circles. Is you could go back in and colour in the circles, but what can look quite cool as well is, instead of drawing in the circles or filling in the circles, you can actually fill in the little triangles of space in between, because you get your sort of like, I suppose they're diamonds really, aren't they? And what's quite nice about doing that way is that it really starts to disappear off the grid. So where you've got this little cross, you can then put a few more lines kind of going through and make a sort of starburst in between each one. And that sort of makes the grid vanish a bit. I'll see if I can get in a tad closer on that. Let me just shuffle round. It has quite a short depth of field, the camera, so you have to sort of, the closer you get, the less you get in focus. But you can just see, just by where I've got the cross there, just by going, through it again and again, you get a little sort of bit of tone and a bit of shade, but it starts to disappear, so people can't see how you've drawn it. And then it starts to look really all like, wow, you've drawn all those circles by hand, and you've got all the angles perfect, aren't you clever? And you go, yes, I am really good. But again, just by bringing all those lines in and creating little sort of star points, it just changes the way it feels. And where you get down here, where you've got your, we're thinking a little bit more about shadow and tone on this to get this kind of illusion. You can draw in your gaps in between, but maybe get your lines really close together so they become quite dark. And once you've almost just sort of like colouring those in between, because they're so small, they're so tight together, you get that sort of much darker feel. And you might even put a little bit of shading into some of the white circles to kind of give that, as if there's a feel of this one casting a shadow on this one. So you could just go in and put a few little shade lines into your pattern, just like that, just to sort of give that a feeling as if it's having a shadow cast on it by the one of the stripy one, which is in front. So again, if you just do a little few simple shade lines just along the top of those, it just helps to give it that kind of feel and keep the spaces in between quite dark as it gets closer to the one in front. Like that. So I'm not going to draw all of those in now because I want to move on to like a different pattern. So we've got two, but you can see if I pull back a bit, hopefully, just that little colouring in between the circles kind of gives that quite a nice three-dimensional kind of feel. It's got like sort of an illusion, and I would certainly want to go back and spend some time just sort of adding some extra detail in. Again, my old adage of the closer that you pack your lines, the darker it's going to look, but just sort of keep adding a few more in just to give that a really nice sense of shadow, and it starts to really enhance that kind of 3D effect. Okay, right. So now we're on to this one here. So what we're going to do with this one here? Well, I think we'll maybe go for something that looks a bit like a ball of string. So we're going to do, this can be quite fun. It can get you completely confused, but I'm going to do lines in the same kind of way, but I'm not going to worry about them being too accurately spaced. All I want to do is kind of make sure that they're slightly curved. So I'm going to do a double line each time, and you've got to think about that as being a bit like a piece of string. So if my piece of string is coming down from the equator down, it's still going to kind of follow the curve of the circle, but it doesn't have to be a perfect. I'm deliberately letting it be a bit wobbly because I want it to look more like a ball of string. But when it hits that bit of string, it's got to go underneath it. So we stop the line and we continue underneath. So we've got that underneath string kind of feel. And then this line's going to come up this way. And again, doesn't matter if it's slightly wobbly because it's meant to be slightly more organic in kind of feel. And we just keep bringing the lines going round and round this ball of string. And we can put a line, wanted to put a line going that way, again, just give it a little bit of a curve. And it's going to come through and round. And if we wanted to weave a bit more, if we stop our line short like that, and then we get another one that comes in to go over that one, like that. See, that's just given that sort of overlap. And then this one continues on underneath. You know, I imagine this is what London would look like if you could see all the tube lines sort of actually put together. Now I've got this one here, I can continue that one and disappear it off under this. And then this one, I'm going to bring this one into the space here, but I'm going to stop it again because then that allows me to bring one in from here and go across it. So it's a bit like Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham or somewhere, all these sort of lines crossing over each other. So this one can continue on under and it can wiggle off. And they don't have to go totally accurate, you know, they can just wiggle off in different directions. They can change directions sort of halfway through. I've got this one here, so I want to bring this one to come over. So that's going to come up to that line. And you'll see that as you sort of get more and more in, they get more and more congested, so the ones below are going to be packed in sort of, you know, underneath. These are all the strings that have been wrapped on top, and then you get sort of more strings underneath. So we can take some more lines and you can decide. And if you're amazingly clever, probably more clever than I've seen people do these that look like complete basket work with all the lines going under and over in a beautiful rhythm, and I have never managed to achieve that because I always get I always miss one and then it's like, no. So I'm going to stick to my crazy string. But I quite like the effect of all these crazy strings kind of going over and under. And moving them through the sort of space and wrapping them. And then this one's got to go, oh, it's going to go up to here. Look, that's going to wrap around there. And what I might do is where they come to the edge of your circle line, I mean the circle outline, don't mean the circle line train station, you can do like a little half moon bump like that at the end and just bring it above that circle line on top, and it starts to look like they are actually wrapping around to make a ball of string kind of idea. Now you can just keep going on and on doing this until you've just got a mass of lines, but I think with that you tend to get a little bit confused, so I'm going to do a few more and then I'm going to we're going to colour in the spaces in between into sort of shadow, and then we're going to add a little bit of shadow on some of these stringy pieces so that they really look like they're crossing over each other. So I'm going to bring another one from, if you want to bring one that just comes around the edge, it can just sort of like scoop over the edge, and then again I'm going to stop it so I can bring one to overlap it. So I'm going to bring that one up like that and disappear it off underneath. And just take these under, disappearing through into this big mass of string. Like that. And we'll just do a couple more and then we're going to put some shading in between. So I'm going to take one sort of scooting around the edge. It's just that thing of, have you ever unravelled a golf ball? I don't know if you ever got, it usually happens when you've got a dog and the dog gets the golf ball. And I used to have a dog that was obsessed with doing this, and he would crack the sort of white off, and underneath it's actually made of all these rubber strings sort of packed really tightly around a sort of hard centre. And because they're all under tension, as you start to, if you're a dog, if you start to play with them, they sort of unravel themselves, but they sort of do it in bits. So, and they sort of fling off into space. So he'd be there and this thing would sort of, he'd put it down and then look at it and then it would start to unravel and it would throw itself around the floor. And then it would stop again and he'd sort of give it another nudge and he'd keep him going for hours. But I always feel that these are a bit like this sort of feel of that, all those strings wrapped around each other. Right, so once you've got like quite a good spaghetti of strings, I'm just going to pop one in the edge there just because I can. Then I'm going to take I'm just going to do a little bit of shading in between them. So I'm going to get my brush pen again and I'm just going to fill the spaces in between the strings so they start to give, you can see the strings on top. So we're going to first of all paint all the shapes in between. I want to say squares, but they're not really. You get squares, you get triangles, you get parallelograms and even octagons sometimes, depending on how many you've got. But I'm just going to fill those in as sort of dark spaces below. And I'm trying to do it so I'm not taking too long over it, but still keeping it neat. I think on this edge here, I want to put another line in quickly because there's going to be too much of a black space if I don't. So I'm just going to very quickly whiz another little one that's popped in there. That's it. And I can see a white stripe. Let's get rid of that white in there. Right, so just going to fill that in so we get all those shapes appearing, and it starts to make our pattern look a lot stronger and darker. And just fill in all those little holes that you've got going. And I'm just going to do one more. Then I'm going to just show you what I'm going to do once I'm imagining that all this has been filled in and I've got all my dark spaces in there. I want to look at where some of these strings overlap. I'm going to put a little bit of shadow into that as well to make that look a bit more three-dimensional, to enhance all this kind of weaving. So I'm going to do a little bit of that and then I'll pop back to my colouring in bit. So if I come again a little bit closer, like this, where you've got these overlapping, the one on top is always going to be a bit brighter and the one underneath is going to cast a shadow. So I just do a couple of extra lines but then spread them out. So you just do one really tight and then a couple spreading out like that, and that immediately really makes the top one look like it's travelling over the bottom one. So the same thing is going to happen here. So just like a couple of lines, one close together, two sort of a bit more spread out, and that starts to make that string really travel on top of the ones below. And when I've got this side, this is my on top string, so I can just do 1, 2, 3, just 3 little lines like that, just to make that look like it's sticking up. 1, 2, 3, like that. And where it's disappearing under the ball on top here, I'm going to continue that shading on and kind of disappear it in underneath. So it kind of got that nice, and it should really start to have this nice sort of depth kind of quality. So with this one here, 3 little lines, 1, 2, 3, then some white space, and then 1, 2, 3 disappearing into underneath that dark one. It really gives it a lot of kind of 3D, and you can sit there and think, right, is this one going on top? Right, so this one's going on top, so I've got to have a little bit of shadow there. If it comes straight away into one that's sort of appearing on top, just cut the shadow short, as it were, and leave a little bit of white. And this one down here, everyone's travelling over that one, so that one's going to be quite dark. And just a few, and then just make sure you've got your shadows, the dark spaces in nice and strong. And that will start to give this a really strong feel of things overlapping. So this bit here, this can all be slightly darker because it's going underneath those ones on top. And we're just using the pattern, simple lines, but just to help us get that more kind of 3D feel. And if you want to get really smart, where these ones go towards the edge of the circle, they would probably have a little bit of tone as well. So you can just pop a few little stripes in just to kind of give those a slight bit of tone. And obviously I'm going to fill into where the lines go. So that will really start to give that this kind of in and out illusion, which is a lovely way of thinking about how all this pattern is sort of completely unreal, and yet it can still have its own reality, it can still have its own weight and depth. So I'm just going to very quickly sort of block in where this would go. I'll have to go back later if I get a chance and tidy it all up, but I just want to very quickly get these sort of dark areas in so we can see the kind of weight of this one. And again, it's lovely there's something about giving yourself these little areas to concentrate on that I think is really useful, and thinking about them as objects in space, because there's something about having that border to work to, the border of the circle each time. It's that thing of like, well, at the very least you can say, well, if I'm not mad on this pattern, I've only got to fill it into this one little space, and then I can do something different. And each time you do one, you're learning a different trick, you're learning experimenting with different patterns, so you can really develop your patterns across the surfaces, doing a little bit, giving each one a little circle to play in, as it were. And at the end of it, you get this sort of lovely composite image that tones all together because you're using the same materials and the same sort of ideas, but yet it's got these different parts to it. Right, so there's our sort of, we've got sea urchin, we've got disco ball, we've got the ball of string. Right, so I'd quite like to have a go at doing, because if we imagine at the moment we've seen all our circles kind of from the side, basically. So I want to imagine that we're sort of turning one of them and looking down on the top. So from the top we would see maybe a bit more of a spiral kind of feel. So I think it'd be quite nice to do one that was sort of spirally in aspect. So I'm going to pick on this one here. Obviously you can pick on whichever one you fancy making a spiral. So I'm just going to have a quick T mute, if that makes sense. Right, so I want to do a kind of spiral. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to decide where my kind of, you've got to imagine these are kind of like on a, like a sort of globe, and they've got a sort of rod running through them. So these ones, they're sort of, this is their top and the bottom, their poles are here. So with this one, I'm going to make this the kind of top of where my spiral will come in. You can choose any spot that you like. And we're going to do a spiral that's going to come out and round. And as it comes around, it's going to get bigger, and then it's going to disappear off the sides. So I'm just going to imagine I'm doing a big sort of snail shell spiral. I'm not even going to imagine it, I'm going to actually do it, and it's going to get wider as it goes round, and then when it hits the edge of the globe, it's got to stop and it's got to reappear. So just do the same thing of like keeping your pen moving and then imagining, oh, it's got to come off, it's going to come round again, so it's going to reappear sort of about here, and then it's going to come round, and then it's going to hit there and disappear and reappear, and as it comes round, we'll just see those last few kind of whirls, and they're going to be getting a bit closer together. So I've got this sort of spiral happening. So I'm starting up small and just letting it, stopping it as it hits the edge, and then picking it up again and getting it to kind of spiral and zoom round in that kind of way. So I can then, if I want to get it even tighter, I can just ignore that initial starting point, just give it an extra swirl round in a kind of, so this is getting very kind of hypnotic, psychedelic kind of swirl. So we can now do the same thing. We can put our pattern or whatever we're going to do into this spiral, because we've now got the spiral to kind of guide us. So I'm going to try putting like a chevron pattern, because hopefully this should give us a sort of direction. So if you find it hard to start right in that tiny centre point, because it's a bit hard to see where you're starting, I'm going to start slightly away from it and get the majority of it in, and then come back and do that bit last, like the cherry on the cake. So I'm just going to do very simple diagonals, but I'm going to bring them round and they're going to spiral round. Now, I'm keeping mine flat, which is going to give it one kind of look. If you get really kind of keen, you could actually make these half moon kind of lines, and that will actually give this kind of like a snail shell feel. But if you just keep your lines going round, and I find if you try not to let them match up with this one, so don't join up the one in the row before, as it were, so you just make them at odds with each other, you'll be able to see them and they won't get completely lost and sort of blend in together. And then as they come round, they're just going to spiral round, and they're getting slightly larger each time because you've got your spirals is getting larger. And I can bring that spiral in and round, and it's coming round, and just make sure that you don't join up your spiral lines, and you'll find it much easier to see where they go. Otherwise you tend to get a bit confused, and when you come here, imagine that pattern keeping going, but they're just going to disappear off that edge and they're going to reappear coming round and getting bigger. And this is starting to look like sort of mosaic tiles, isn't it, or spiral staircase going down into space. And then there'll be a few more that are just going to see, and they're going to be getting smaller together and disappearing down like that. And then that gives us, and because I've used straight ones, it's actually starting to slightly play with the shape that we've got. If you use curved ones, it will look more like a sort of snail curve. If you use straight ones, it gives something different. So once I've got that bit, the main bit done, I can kind of go the other way and just get that last and little tiny bit in. But you tend to find they get really small really quickly, because that's the way spirals work. The centre is absolutely tiny, and it seems to get bigger quite quickly. So as you come round, you're going to get really tight lines, and if you end up just really doing a kind of black centre, that's fine, because that's how it's going to go. So that starts to look like, it does look like quite an illusion, as if it has got like a spiral staircase moving down into, like, whereas all the other ones have been kind of roundy, this is starting to look like it's sort of disappearing off maybe. It's almost like this is like a hole, isn't it? And this is sort of like a view through that hole, which I think is sort of quite interesting. So we could do more line work around that. We could just keep adding some, subdividing all those lines that we've got, and we get quite a sort of interesting effect. So what I'm going to do is with these lines, I'm going to just do halfway up that space. So I'm just doing a line coming from that top edge, but I'm going to let it stop sort of halfway through that white space. So it does have, it's adding more tone, but it's just adding, it's also leaving some more white areas, and we'll see what effect that gives. And as I come down to the bigger areas, I'm going to put a couple in, because there's more room, so I can get a couple more in just to see how that kind of works. And I'm just leaving the top half of each of those segments white, so that I'm leaving them being light, and the lines are adding texture, but they're also adding tone across the shape. And I'm just going to keep on working round. And I think that's sort of quite interesting compared to the, it's doing something different to the other shapes, where I think it's quite interesting. As I'm coming down, I can get even more of these lines, sort of keeping them quite even, but getting more in as they seem to want to add in naturally. I'm trying to avoid the ones on the row below. Don't always succeed. I don't think it matters too much. But I think we just bring that round and see where this takes us. We're going to go all the way round. And again, when you hit that edge, you've got to bring that line right up so that that edge is sort of filled up with that space. And it kind of gives it, again, that feeling that this is maybe a hole and not a globe, as we're sort of playing with it differently. And going to carry on round and reappear on that side, and carry on. And you can do, again, you can do a similar thing like this with tone. You could do shading that clung close to one side of the spiral and then faded out towards the far side, and that would have a similar kind of, it would be a similar idea, but it would give you a different kind of feel. And as I come down here, again, plenty of these lines can come in. And it's as simple as mark making, but I think it's quite effective to kind of bring those sort of tones and shades in and do something different from what we've been doing with the other ones. And I can just fill those last bits in. Yeah, so that's given us another thing. And then if we wanted to, we could go in again and we could do little tiny lines that are going halfway up. Those halfway lines, so quarter lines, I suppose. Another similar way you can do this is to use different pen widths. So you'd use a thinner pen in the middle of your spiral, and then getting out to thicker pens, going out to your 0.5s and your 0.6s as you go down. But I'm just going around now and doing little tiny quarter width lines in between, and that's starting to add more tone again and more depth. And you start off by sort of dividing each of the lines you've got in half, and then realizing you can put like 2 quarter lines in between the half lines, and that's creating a different kind of effect, kind of going round and round. Quite hypnotic, really, quite draws you down. And you could do the same thing again if you wanted to use colour pens. You could do your longest lines in your palest colour pen, and then so you could do yellow long lines, and then orange midway lines, and red quarter lines, and that would give you the gradation in the colour, the sort of ombre in the colour would help to enhance this kind of effect again. So I can disappear off almost into darkness there. And it's just layering on those lines and seeing how they create this, seeing, how they affect what you're doing, the different impressions that they give, the different surface that they help you describe. And we can just bring those round. Round we go again, round the horn. And we nearly are done on these lines. And the last one's underneath. And there we go. That's sort of done all of those lines there. And that's given that a very sort of different feel, as if it was something that we were looking into a hole to see, or whether it was something, and you could even go around again, and you could do like, you could just thicken up that line. I'm not going to do that now because we're going to move on to another one. But yeah, right, okay. So that's, again, playing with it as a different kind of way. Let's look at a smaller circle. There's one just popping behind these others. So I'm going to do... I want to do a grid in the same kind of way as I did before, a similar kind of way to what I did before. But I'd like to, I'm not going to draw the circles in. I want to keep looking at the sort of diamond shapes that we get in between. So this is a smaller circle. So when I draw it, my lines are going to move, I suppose, a bit more quickly. Well, not quickly, but they're going to move over a smaller surface. So I'm going to do, again, the straight line up the middle, and then my curved lines curving out this way. And I'm going to really try and keep the roots of the lines really close together and push that sort of curve out towards the side. And then the same on this one, but obviously going in the other direction, just to bring those lines through in a different kind of way. And I'm going to put the other lines running across, so that's my first kind of equator line going that way. And then I'm going to bring, and I want to just make sure that I push those curves so we keep the lines at the root of where they come from quite close together, and bring them along. And then same, one more kind of bending down this way, and then giving myself quite a nice shape, kind of coming round. But obviously you want to make this grid look different to the circle grid. So with the squares that I've got here, I'm going to imagine that they're kind of like quilted sort of diamond shapes. So I'm just going to do, if I do it on this big one here, I'll come in a bit close and you can see. So I'm going to imagine that the bottom point is kind of the bottom of a diamond. I'm going to see them as diamonds rather than squares. So I'm just going to bring a line up to halfway and then stop it, and then fan those lines out to the sides one way, and then fan them out to the side to the other, and that kind of gives again that little bit of shadow. And you've got, so now you imagine this is kind of highlight and this is shadow. So on the next line, same sort of next diamond, same thing, a line up to the middle like that, and then a little fan of lines kind of coming across, and this should hopefully start to put some form into these shapes. So I'm hoping that these little diamonds start to look a bit like, the diamonds like you get on pineapples, those sort of, but a more geometric version with those sort of, so they should look like they're hopefully pointing out, and they're slightly spiky in feel. So I'm going to keep on adding those in, and just give it, and where I've got this sort of overlap here, if I try and work out where my middle line would be first, and then almost just do just the one side, just sort of bring those over. But I'm hoping that this, as we sort of build up more of this, we'll start to see this form appearing on these shapes and becoming different. So it's definitely different from the round shapes. It's much more geometric. And just follow the shape you've got. So we've got a slightly wobbly one like this. Do your middle line the same way, and then just let your fanning slightly drop down on one side. So bring that line up, and someone joining us. got cats leaping in on the act again. And just bring those through. And you can see that's starting to give that almost like sort of something quilted, that kind of feel, like those sort of lovely... I'm thinking of a velvet I used to make wedding dresses out of back in the day. I used to have this lovely quilted velvet. I used to make medieval style dresses with it, sleeves made out of it, which were really beautiful. I had that lovely soft kind of feel with this sort of bumpy texture. You want to run your finger over it and feel it. And then when you get to sort of... I'm wondering at this point if we want to switch kind of the shading over, so that when we go to, as it were, over the top of the hill, that we're sort of coming the other way. I'll do that and see what it looks like. So I'm just going to do one more row like at that sort of level. So I'm going to make sure all these ones have got their shading underneath like that. So I just quickly put those in. I'm going to flip it and we'll see what it looks like. You can always just sit and watch for this bit and see whether you like it or not, because I'm going to do an experiment to see what it looks like. So then I'm going to then bring it down to meet them on the other way, as if our shading is sort of changing direction as we're heading up north, as it were, of this particular globe. There we go. And again, with the smaller squares, they're going to be filled in more because you're following the shape that you've got. No, I think that works. I think that looks quite cool. And I'm going to continue that line, that shading up above. So in the sort of north section, as it were, we have the shading coming down from the top, which kind of gives us a bit of a highlight in the middle. And just leaving that little triangle of white, or at least a little hint of it, as you disappear around the top. And I think that's working quite nicely. I'm going to just do the last few bits in there, and then we've just about got time to think about one more, I think, before I will leave the rest up to your explorations. So I'm just filling in those last little bits in there. So you can see how you can use the basic idea of creating this sort of grid, and just by changing the pattern shapes that you've got two very different feel of two very different, or circles, spheres that feel very different. I'll get some words out in a minute, but that actually look, you know, that they're doing something different. They don't look too similar. They're not sort of being... I'm just going to try putting a little bit of light on, and hopefully that's a bit not too shiny. Right. So we've got one... I think we've got time to sort of start on one more. So let me come back and let's have a look at one that we can fit into. Let's have a look at this one here. So this one, I'm just going to show you, we're just going to do very simple kind of, but we're going to use a wiggly line rather than a straight line and see how that works out for us. So what I want to imagine is that I've got wiggly lines going sort of around the equators of this sort of shape. So I'm going to start off with the biggest sort of one, as it were, and this one is going to be maybe the flattest, but just sort of take that wiggly line across and then make it double by doing another line underneath it, and then keeping this line again very close to kind of where you started, and then letting it go a little bit fatter and then bringing it back down. So again, same thing, just keeping it close together, letting it open out and bring it back up. And you might want to sort of follow, like one of those sound waves, following the line that you've got above, but just bringing them back to the same point each time, so that each time you're sort of stretching that line round a bit more, but almost coming back to the same point where you start each time, letting them open up a little bit and then bringing them right back up, almost so they're drawing on top of each other. And again, you're creating a kind of root point where they're growing out of. And we can just bring those lines, and as you get round towards the bottom, they're all going to get quite closely packed together, because we want to get more lines in to give that illusion of curve. And we just follow the line above, but we just get closer and closer, and sometimes you get quite nice moments where the lines almost sort of touch, and they again look like sort of sound waves, but I'm just going to keep trying to pack them in as closely as possible down towards the bottom, and that's giving weight until eventually I can find that circle that I've drawn in pencil and just pick that up, and I can just maybe even go slightly above. So that's quite a nice effect. So I'm going to do the same thing going up with this one, but again trying to keep the starting point pretty much the same and letting that line wiggle across and then bring it back down on each side, so they're almost starting at the same point. And to start with, let them open up a bit and let them wiggle across, and then they're gradually going to get tighter together. I need to try and keep them really close together, as if you were sort of, threading through a bead and you had to come out of the same bead, the bead hole, top and bottom or side to side each time. And you can bring those lines, and again, just imagine that they're travelling underneath those spheres and coming out the other side. There we go, and we can just put that one in, and you can just sort of imagine seeing half disappearing up, and then underneath here we can just get them to go really close together because we want to add a bit of shadow in. And that's really quite effective, isn't it? It gives it a really lovely feel, but it's really quite simple when you sort of think about how, once you've got the idea of how to do it, it works. It's quite effective. It really gives this nice sort of wobbly surface. It feels a bit like the edge of a shell or something, or sort of like folded paper. And you could, if you wanted to, if you were get your own really tiny pens and go back and fill in some pattern again in between these lines, like some little circles, going smaller and smaller, tight into those corners, and then opening up again. And that's got another kind of sea creature feel to it. I'm just going to do one line of these just to show you how you can do that. And again, you just follow the shapes that you've drawn, so you don't have to worry about the size of your circles. You just let them expand and contract to fill that little border line, and it just helps to give that feeling of how that's going to all move together. So you could build up, or you could do loads into that one, and that sort of be really quite decorative. So how are we doing for time? Right, okay, so we'll do one more. Right, so on this one, we're going to do one that's sort of like a bit like scales, I suppose. So I'm going to start with a middle row again. I find it's much easier if you start in the middle, because you kind of like help to establish your pattern. So I'm going to do just half moon or sort of W bumps, I suppose. Don't have to be exactly the same size. I'm just going to do them going across. So initially it kind of looks like it's sort of denying the shape a bit, but I'm just going to do them, and they're going to get smaller, and they're going to sort of go slope down towards this point here. So I'm going to do another row, and if you try and do them so they fit in between, so that you get the bump hitting the triangle of the one above, that's what you're sort of aiming for. And as you come towards the sides, you kind of make them a little bit narrower if you can, and then a little bit bigger in the I was going to say in the morning then, gosh, I don't know where that one came from. A little bit bigger in the middle, and a little bit smaller, and then as they come down, because they're sort of scaled, they don't have to be, we're imagining sort of fish scales and that sort of thing, they don't have to be perfect and regular and like sort of machine pattern, so they can come a bit smaller. And what you're aiming to do is get them smaller as you go down. So as you come down towards the bottom, you can like put in a couple of extras so that you can get those bumps looking a bit smaller, and they're sort of overlapping, and they've got this sort of fish scale feel, or crocodile, no, not crocodiles, they're more like fishes or snake scales really, aren't they? And as they come down, they get smaller and smaller and more packed tight together, but it's still just that sort of bumpy up and down line. And you could totally do like some grids on these in pencil, and then that would help kind of guide you down. But you can also freehand them like this and they still work really nicely. And sometimes they match up, sometimes they don't. It doesn't really matter. They create different sort of patterns as you go down. And as you get down to the bottom, you get them really small and little tiny ones all kind of bumping in together. And then you're going to do the same thing but kind of going the other way. So again, as we go up, they're going to slightly starting to get smaller, and they can kind of overlap, and you want slightly more kind of pushing them in. And if you want to get them to go smaller, just do a couple of extra ones, and that allows you to jump across the gaps and get a bit smaller each time. And we're going to pack them in. And you can always do a few extras. If you feel that you're disappearing off on one side, just put a few more extra ones in. This is quite a nice kind of, one of those times we use the word organic a lot. It's a nice sort of organic pattern. And again, if you can get them a bit smaller towards the edges, that helps kind of illusion. And a bit bigger in the middle, and then a bit smaller. But again, it starts to look like a piece of snake skin or fish scales on a kind of round fish, on a blowfish perhaps. And we can bring, and they're going to disappear in, and as they get into that top area, they're going to get smaller and smaller. And once they start, and again, just let them disappear under that top, our original sphere. And we should just about have filled all those sort of in. And then if we want to give it sort of more kind of 3D effect, where they're on the edges here, you can just make them slightly bulge out away from your pencil line, and that kind of makes it look a bit as if they're a bit more 3D. Just sort of take that line so they kind of become quite bumpy like that, and on the side as well, just sort of make them a little bit bumpier. And then if you want to get in and do some shading on them, you can just, where you're going to get the shadows, this sort of curved edge is going to cast shadow on the one below. So we just put a little bit of few lines in, just to be little shadow lines. And you could totally do, anyone who knows my Professor Pangolin drawing, I did this drawing and each scale that I did, I drew a pattern into each of these scales. So I did in each of his scales, I did a spiral pattern or a flower pattern, something like that, into each one. And you could do that just as well here. But with this one, I'm just going to add a few little lines just to start getting some tone, some feeling to make this really, make it feel really bumpy. And I'm going to do slightly more shading on the ones at the edge, because that will make the edge look like it's curving away. And as I come down to the bottom and I've got the really tiny ones, they're going to have more shading lines on them because they're disappearing around the curve of that sphere. So you can see just by adding some slightly darker lines, I just move my camera so it's not quite so fuzzy. You might just see, just to follow that shape each way round and just put a few more shade lines in. I'm leaving a tiny little bit of white on each scale. But that will help to give it a kind of illusion of it being a round shape. And again, you can do the same thing with colour pencil if you want a much softer effect. You just do a little bit of shading on each one, leaving a little bit of white on each surface. And there we go. And that sort of just gives that a bit more kind of form. And as you get them up here again, that it's going to still cast on the one above, just a little bit of shadow. And I think that just helps on here. With these ones, we can just make them really dark because they're now getting the shadow from the original, the first sphere that we did. So they're going to be a bit darker again. But just keep on adding lines, just keep thinking, where do I need shadow? Right, I'll just do more lines onto that bit and leave the paper white where I want to be highlights. So again, just where those curved lines come round, you get a little bit of shadow like that. Right, and I think I'm probably going to have to call it a day there, but obviously there's plenty more circles to draw. But I hope you're getting the overall effect that we've now got this sort of fantastic collection of spheres all kind of rolling and bobbling together. And you can see how just by using these just these very simple rules of using these curved lines just to think about the shape that you're doing, and if you can get a sort of grid for yourself, then you can go back and you can put in more complicated patterns, and you've got something to follow which will allow you to shape those patterns and continue that kind of illusion effect. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed my great balls of doodle.